It's not like a case where we have a body and we're trying to figure out what happened. It's a real little boy who is missing, and that is incredibly difficult.
From Mamamia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to the No Filter podcast, where I talk to interesting people with stories to tell. If you have ever been responsible for a child and temporarily lost sight of them, you'll know the feeling. It's a plummeting in your stomach at the same time as a gushing rush of adrenaline through the rest of your body. You want to be sick and run all at the same time. And that's what happened to a woman whose name I can't tell you back on the 12th of September 2014. In the mad panic of that moment, when she frantically looked for her little boy in the immediate vicinity, she called 000 to report that her son had gone missing.
Police emergency, this is Simone.
Yeah, hi, my son is missing. He's 3.5.
Okay.
Sorry.
What's your address?
Benaroon Drive,
Yep.
Kendall.
Okay, Benaroon Drive in Kendall?
Yes.
All right, I'm just going to bring that up on my map. It won't be a moment.
Thank you.
How long has he been missing?
We've been looking for him now for about 15 or 20 minutes, but
Okay.
I thought it could be 5, it could be longer, because he was just playing around here. We heard him, and then we heard nothing.
So he's been missing since about 10:30?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay, can you describe him to me? How tall? Obviously not very tall. But
No,
approximately
he'd be about 2.5 feet. He's wearing a Spiderman outfit.
Yeah. What colour hair has he got?
He's got dark sandy-coloured hair. It's short, and he's got really big browny green-coloured eyes.
That little boy was William Tyrrell, and the woman's voice you just heard was his foster mother. But it would be years after she made this call and after William went missing that we'd know the circumstances of William's life. And 5 long years later, we still don't know the circumstances of his disappearance. William Tyrrell, the little boy in the picture wearing a Spiderman suit that we all have indelibly etched in our mind, was born in 2011 to his biological parents, whose names we aren't legally allowed to know either. At just 9 months, William was placed into foster care with his older sister, who was herself a toddler at the time. On the day he went missing, William was just 3 years old, and he was playing outside at his foster grandmother's house in Kendall, New South Wales, while she and his foster mum sat nearby drinking a cup of tea. So what actually happened on that day? Did William wander off, or was he taken? And is there a chance that he's still alive? Journalist Caroline Overington works at The Australian, and she spent the past year looking into the disappearance of William Tyrrell for her podcast Nowhere Child, where she speaks to William's biological family and other members of the public who've been involved in this case that at the time of recording is still an open investigation. And Caroline joins me now to talk about it. The story of William Tyrrell, when it's retold, is often one that starts on the day that he goes missing. But I wanted to go before that, which is the day that he's taken into care. How old was he when he was taken away from his biological parents, and why was he taken away?
Well, he was 9 months old, and actually we can go even further back than that, because his parents had another child before he was born. And it's often the case when children are taken into care that their siblings will then be taken into care. It's very hard to break that cycle. And it's also, if you were yourself a child in care, the chances are that your children will end up in care. Not all the time, but it does seem to be generational. So William had a sister whose name is Lindsay. That's the name the court's given to her, so we can use that. And she went into care when she was 3 months old. Now, her parents, her mum in particular, had a lot of mental health problems and drug addictions. And she was with Lindsay at a party when Lindsay was 3 months old, and the party got out of control. The way sometimes those drug parties do. Police were called, and when they arrived, she began sort of screaming, and she spat at the police, she assaulted them, and of course they decided that Lindsay would be better off in care. She then became pregnant with William. She wasn't pregnant with William yet, but she very quickly became pregnant with William. And when he was born, they feared already that they would come for him straight away because of the mental health issues and the drug addictions. They didn't, in fact, come for him straight away. They suggested to the two of them that they do parenting courses and various other things. But when he was 9 months old, they did come and announced to the parents that they intended to take him into care. And then the parents took off with him. So they ran away rather than hand him over, and they weren't found for about 3 months. They were staying in a granny flat, and they weren't found for about 3 months. Then when the police did find them, they were handcuffed and arrested, and William was lifted out of the stroller and taken into Doc's care.
So he was about 1 by that time?
He was 9 months old, so it was they were on the run for about 3 months.
Mm. Was he placed straight away with the foster family?
Yep, straight away. So the foster parents had decided about a year earlier that they wanted to become carers, and they had done all the courses that you have to do. It's quite a difficult process to become a foster parent. And so they'd done all the courses, and then they were approved, and any foster parent will tell you this, as it seems like a never-ending process to get yourself approved, and then when you're approved there's a child on your doorstep that day because there's such a shortage. And so they were approved, and they were straight away told, there's this little boy and he has a sister, and would you take them both? And they agreed to take them both because William's sister at that time was with a different set of carers up sort of in the Central Coast, and they put William with the foster carers, and then they brought Lindsay the next week, and the brother and sister were reunited. Now since then there's been another 2 children born, another brother and another sister, so William is in fact one of 4.
Tell me a little bit about the foster family, which in your podcast you call the Fosters.
There's almost nothing we can tell you legally. There's a suppression order even on their profession. We can't tell you the suburb they live in. We've described it as being a pretty suburb, which is about as far as our lawyers will go. There are really strict controls on the kinds of things that you can say about, well, in any case where a child is presumed dead, there's already suppression orders, but this is doubly so because it involves foster care.
You've worked as a journalist in the court system on and off for many years. Why is there this secrecy around foster children and then also around if anything bad happens to a child?
Look, it's really complex, but I mean, I don't really understand why you can't name or identify a child that is dead. I really don't. But in New South Wales, you can't identify a victim of crime. So let's say, for example, mum's boyfriend kills a baby. You will never see the name or the picture of that baby because that baby is a victim of crime and it's against the law. It's a victim of murder. Now, who does that law actually protect? I mean, I think that's really worth some debate. That law would, it seemed to me, protect the perpetrators because the child is already dead. Now, when it comes to foster care, the argument is that you can't identify children who are in foster care because they'll be stigmatised. Everyone will know then that they're foster kids. But the idea that you have a little boy who's missing and no one who loves him is able to advocate for him, no one is able to stand up and say, you know, to the public, we need your help. We have to find him is, to me, pretty scandalous.
So the Fosters, if we go back a couple of years before William's disappearance, William was 9 months old. His sister Lindsay was about 18 months?
Slightly older, yes.
They're placed with the Fosters. Mm-hmm. And then when you foster a child, how does the department sort of govern how much contact they have with their biological family? How's that navigated between the foster family and the biological family?
Well, a lot of that depends on what the goal is. So for some children, the goal is to be reunited with their biological family. So say, for example, you're a mother and you're going into prison. And a lot of the women who are in prison in Australia are there because of drug and alcohol or welfare fraud. So let's say, for example, you're going into prison, your child goes into foster care. Well, you're probably not going to lose that child forever. When you come out, the child is going to be reunited with you. So they'll maintain a regime of contact. That's what it's called, contact. They'll make sure that the child is delivered to you in prison so you stay in touch. And then when you get out of prison, you won't get your child back straight away, but there'll be a number of meetings where, you know, the department checks out that you're off drugs, that you've done your parenting course, those kinds of things. And the idea is that you'll be reinstated or you will be able to get your child back. In other cases, it becomes apparent over a period of time that the children will never be able to go home to their biological parents because of ongoing issues in the family home. And in William's case is really interesting because it seems to fall between those two extremes. His biological parents are absolutely convinced that he did not need to be in care, that they obviously had issues, but they were committed to trying to solve those problems. His father has almost always worked. He's got like a construction licence that allows him to drive heavy machinery, and he too has had some drug addiction problems which he's addressed. And they had hoped to one day get their children back. And in fact, when William went missing, they had 2 children. As I said, he's one of 4. They had 2 children in their care when William went missing. So it was an unusual case in that she wasn't the kind of mother that one child after another got taken. She was the kind of mother where they were trying to see whether or not she would ever be able to get her kids back. At the same time, we do know that the Fosters had made the first inquiries about adopting both William and Lindsay, and the biological parents had not been told. And so they found out, actually, during this whole inquest, that these inquiries were being made and that conversations were occurring within the department about how their children would be adopted. And they were obviously quite distressed.
How often did William and Lindsay see their biological parents in the couple of years that they lived with the Fosters before William disappeared?
The regime varied from year to year, so it depended, but we do know that they last saw them 3 weeks before William went missing. So there was a visit prior to that, about 2 months prior to that was cancelled because of ill health. Now, what usually happens is if someone gets sick, the visit gets cancelled, then you have to go and organise it again. And these visits, they can seem a little, you just turn up for a visit, but it's not quite like that. You have to have social workers present. The social workers have to know the children. There have to be report takers there who can take notes as to what's going on. So the last visit that they had with William before he disappeared, it took place at the Chipmunks Play Centre. That's a common location. Sometimes it can be at a McDonald's or something, or it can be in a park. But there were 3 social workers present sitting on the sidelines taking notes as to the interactions between... Wow. Well, it has to be that way. I mean, I covered a case once, the most traumatic circumstances imaginable in Victoria where a woman had adopted a young boy, and she had been really open to the idea that the biological mother should keep seeing him and that they should have a relationship. And she allowed him to go on a contact visit with the mother, and the mother stabbed him to death and drowned him in the lake in Daylesford. In fact, there is still a monument to that little boy in Daylesford, like a little cubby house. It was a horrendous case because, she had tried to ensure that he would always know who his mum was, and she killed him.
Hearing about these visits, they sound horrendous from everyone's point of view. From the Foster's family, I imagine it would feel so weird and disruptive and scary. From the biological family, the noise I made before was the idea of trying to have a visit with children with 3 people sitting there watching, taking notes. That would be an awful situation. And I imagine for the children as well, it's pretty confusing.
Sure, and I think that's one of those things about this case. I mean, people who attempt to cover it come in for a lot of criticism because you can be accused of taking one side or the other. But it seems to me that there doesn't seem to be much point in kind of glossing over how complex the situation is. I mean, it's really difficult. If you don't think that your children deserve to be in care, then you are going to feel some antagonism. And if you've taken in 2 children and you're loving them and you're taking care of them, putting them to bed every night, making their lunches and cutting up the carrot sticks for them, you feel like they're yours, and yet you don't have the kind of freedom that you and I have with our own children. It's a really complex and very emotionally fraught situation, and your heart breaks for anyone who's in it, because the idea that you've got the foster parents who really love him and the biological parents who really love him too and everything's hunky-dory. We're human beings. Life is not like that.
I'm going to ask you a difficult question. Where do you think William and Lindsay should have been at that time? Do you think they were better off with the Fosters, or do you think that the biological parents had pulled their lives together enough to at some stage have them brought back to them?
I've come to the case. William will be missing for 5 years this year. So I've come to the case later, when I know that they've already had, the biological parents have gone on and had 2 other children. There have been a range of issues. So it's not possible to say, for me at least, what the situation was then. That decision...
Have the parents cleaned up their act? Or is that awful language to use?
The parents are no longer together. The disappearance of William tore their lives apart, absolutely destroyed them. and his mother in particular is in a very bad way. So how can I look at a situation like that and say and make judgments about whether or not they would be good parents? I mean, their child is missing, and the circumstances in which he's missing are horrific.
But Lindsay's still with the foster family.
That's right.
Have they been allowed to adopt her?
I don't know. And even if you did know, you couldn't say.
The day William goes missing, it's initially fatefully treated like a little boy that's wandered into the bush. I remember hearing about the little boy in the Spiderman suit, and straight away that's what it seemed. Why was this so catastrophic in terms of the decision that was made to treat it like a missing persons case rather than a little boy lost case rather than a potential crime?
Well, it was catastrophic, and it was also understandable because he was visiting that house at Benaroon Drive. He had been there once or twice before, a number of times before, but he didn't really know it that well, and it's surrounded by bush. And so the preservation of human life is the most important thing in the eyes of the police. And so when the 000 call was made...
Police emergency, this is Simone.
Yeah, hi, my son is missing. He's 3.5.
And the police arrived in such a quiet and sleepy community, child abduction, particularly random child abduction, being so incredibly rare, thankfully, in Australia, their immediate response was, he's lost in the bush, he's wandered off, and we have to find him. And part of the reason we have to find him is because he's 3. He's very little. He only really comes up just past your knees. And he's wearing a flimsy sort of nylon Spiderman suit. So the weather is closing in that day. It started to get overcast quite quickly and quite cold. If we don't find him, you've got maybe 8, 10, 12, maximum 24 hours, he's going to die. And so they threw everything at trying to find him. They called for volunteers from a very wide radius, the Taree SES from 40 kilometres away, the local pony club. There were kids on bikes, there were kids on dirt bikes. There were police divers, there were 2 police helicopters, exactly the kind of thing you'd want to see if it was your child. And the reason why that has turned out to be a catastrophe is that very many people were allowed to come and go from the scene without explaining why they were there. So as part of doing the podcast, we had a look at the number of people who were in the street. It seems like there were about 200 pairs of boots trampled on that crime scene. If there were any forensics, they're gone. There was, let's say, for example, there was one man that we know of who came to visit someone in the street, stayed overnight and left the next day. By chance, he drives a four-wheel drive with a tarp on the back, and he was able to tell the coroner that nobody stopped him. There was no cordon set up, so nobody stopped the cars to sort of say, what are you doing? Do you mind if we have a look in the boot? There's a sense of goodwill in the community that took hold, and so neighbours were encouraged to search their own homes. It would be days, and in some cases it would be, well, we've discovered during the inquest it could be years before police knocked on every door. And you can definitely understand it because, as I said, the preservation of life is the most important thing. By the time they got around to the idea that this may have been an abduction, a child snatch, even then I think they thought their first inclination was, their first suspects really were the biological family. They were the ones they went to first to see if they had William. So even then you wouldn't be checking the cars in the street or the neighbours' houses or the, the comings and goings on the local CCTV. Because you think, firstly, that he's lost, and then secondly, you think you've got a good idea who may have him.
Did the Fosters think that as well?
That he was lost, definitely.
No, that his biological parents might have taken him.
Well, one of the things that they were asked very early on was, do you know anyone who might want to take him? They were questioned about whether they had any enemies, did they owe any debts, were there any threats against them, that kind of thing, very standard sort of questioning. And of course, one of the things that came up was the fact that William had biological parents and that they had run off with him once before. When the effort was made to put him into care, they'd taken off. And so I think it was quite reasonable for detectives to say, okay, well, let's go and see whether they've got him. That's a very reasonable. A lot of what the police did is entirely reasonable.
Because I was going to ask you, with the wisdom of hindsight, what could they have done differently? Because, as you said, the priority was to let's get as many people looking for him as possible because they thought they were going to find him.
Yes, although I think that one outcome from the inquest will be that in a case like this, where it's quite obviously complex, you should perhaps establish a cordon. It's not a difficult thing to do, to throw up some tape and to have one officer, say, there checking who comes in and out. I think that will be one likely outcome, one likely recommendation for the police.
How does it work with the police? Because William's foster mother called 000, and I assume the local police were sent to investigate. And then how does it ratchet up to the point where it's on television, it switches from being a lost child to an abduction? I imagine, how does all that work?
Well, that's a function of time. The longer he was missing. I mean, for example, our newsroom is here, the newsroom for News Limited is here in Surrey Hills, and William went missing from Kendall, which is about 4 hours away. And I know that in the initial hours, News Limited didn't send anyone to Kendall because they thought, as everyone did, he'll be found before we even get there. And then as time goes on and you realise he's actually missing and police have started to turn their mind to the idea that he was maybe taken, then the news story starts to gallop. Because that's a very different story. I mean, as you say, there was a child missing earlier this year, was found in a dam on a remote property. That is normally the case. In 97% of cases, when a child is murdered, it is by somebody who's known to them. And in 75% of cases, the child will be found within a 200-metre radius of the last place they were seen. So these cases...
Found alive?
No, not necessarily alive.
But found?
But found. And so these are cases that are solved quickly and they're solved very close to home. And once this was apparent that this was different, then you're dealing with a once-in-a-lifetime crime. I mean, there are people alive today who can probably remember one other missing child.
I remember Samantha Knight.
Right.
When I was growing up in Bondi, ironically.
20-odd years ago.
Yeah, it was 20, and it took 20 years almost, or 15 years, to find her killer and unravel that mystery. And everyone will say the name Maddie McCann. It's seared on the hearts and minds of certainly every parent, but you know, most people will know exactly who that is. It plays into all our worst fears. Did the police ever suspect the foster family?
Suspect is not the right word. So they have, what they do is they rule people out. They rule people in and they rule them out. And obviously you have to rule out the foster family. Of course you do. And they recognise that too. It would be insane for police to turn up at a place where a child has gone missing and not question them about what happened in the immediate hours before he went missing. They very quickly, the very first Sydney detective, Hans Rupp, who appeared at the scene, very quickly decided that they had nothing to do with it. And the second detective, Gary Jubilan, who took over the case and ran it for 3 years, agreed with him that they had nothing to do with it.
When did it change, and who makes the call from when he's wandered off to this is a potential abduction?
So what happens is, you can imagine it, if you like a circle. So when a child goes missing, they look at the immediate circle. So in that case, that would have been his sister, Lindsay, who was 4, his foster mum and her mum. They were the people who were on the scene when he went missing. And once you've ruled them out, then you look at a slightly wider circle. So who else was around that day? Now that would include his foster dad, who was absent from the scene because he'd gone to make a Skype call from somewhere with a better internet capacity. Once you've ruled him out, then the circle widens again. And so you include now the biological family. They have a reason perhaps, they have motive. Now you've ruled them out, and then you widen it again. You start to have a look at people who were in the area at the time. And that's when, of course, the rope takes in the washing machine repairman, Mr. Bill Spedding, who was due to visit or had visited the house a few days before. And if you can imagine that, then once you've sort of exhausted that and the neighbours and the man who came to repair the decking, and did they have Foxtel delivery, was there a pizza delivery guy, once you've exhausted all of those and the circle's getting wider and wider, then you're starting to deal with stranger abduction. Very, very rare.
From a general public point of view, I think my experience, and probably yours, was very typical. I mean, you're a journalist and you're in the newsroom, so yours would have been slightly different. But first you saw the picture of William in the Spiderman suit. The next thing you saw was pixelated images of some people talking that were said to be his parents. Now, that was confusing to most people.
I think it was catastrophic for the case, to be honest.
Can you explain that decision and the impact that it had?
I wish I could explain the decision. I can tell you why it happened, because it's against the law to identify a foster child. Now, they had to identify William. I mean, you're looking for a child, so every single searcher needed to know his name so they could call for him in the bush. And also they needed to know who they were looking for. Like, they were looking for a small boy in a Spiderman suit who looks like this, who's 3 years old and so on. So really the police were able to say, we have to identify him. But then the department which manages foster care in Australia or in New South Wales said that there would be no identification of the parents.
The foster parents or the biological
any
parents?
Of the parents. And so that, in my view, was catastrophic because it meant that nobody was able to come out and say, our son is missing or our foster child is missing, William is missing, can you help us? And the public couldn't get a handle on the story. They started quite realistically and rightly to think something odd here. This is really weird. This is a really weird and unusual situation. What is going on? And that's the last thing you need. The one thing you need is for the public to be 100% behind the case. I mean, there were a number of people. I mean, this week, for example, we've heard that a man was a possible witness to William's disappearance and he didn't come forward. Now, think about the reasons you might not come forward if you think you thought something. So let's say you saw that case and you thought, oh, this is a bit odd, this is a bit strange, they're not telling us everything here, I think I'll just stay out of it. And that appears to be what has happened.
Because the person you mention is someone that says that he saw a little boy in a Spiderman suit standing up in the back seat of a car with his hands against the back windows, being driven by a woman down his street, which was just a couple of streets away.
And I believe him. I believe him. I believe absolutely that is what he thinks he saw. I mean, I sat in the court and I watched him, and the police have done the same, and the police say the same. He believes it. He's in a really interesting situation because he has lived in that town, and it's a small town and it's a friendly town for very, very many years, and he's a good community-minded person, and he thought to himself, well, he saw the police saying, we are going to talk to everyone in the neighbourhood, we'll be around to talk to everyone, so he waited and they didn't come, and then he thought, oh, well, obviously they know what they're doing, but still he was a bit worried about it. So then he thought, well, maybe I'll go and track down the local copper who he knows, who he's always known. He's known all his life. She's usually at the RSL club on the weekend or the local social club on the weekend. So he goes down there hoping to see her. He doesn't run into her, but he does run into her sister-in-law. Again, this is a country town. So he says to the sister-in-law, hey, I think I saw something. Can you let her know? And the sister-in-law says yes. For some reason, the message doesn't get passed on, but he doesn't know that. So he's starting to think, oh, well, I'm just making a fool of myself here because they obviously know what happened and the whole thing's shrouded in secrecy and confusion anyway. I don't want to, cause any difficulties for the police by, insisting, come and take my statement, put me in the middle of things. So he just didn't say anything. And then eventually he didn't say anything else. He'd already done his best. But then word eventually got back to the police that because he told heaps of people. He told his 5 sisters. He told 12 people in total. Now, I thought I had something. I thought I saw something, or I did in fact see something, but, I think the police know what they're doing. I mean, that's a mess.
It's so interesting hearing you describe it like that because I was horrified thinking, well, how could anyone not just pick up the phone? But your point about the pixelated parents, is it an empathy gap that created? Because none of the media organisations explained why they were pixelated.
Because you're not allowed.
So I remember thinking, I wonder if they're in witness protection or something, or if they've been charged with another crime, usually when you see people pixelated, it's because they've been charged with a crime and their names can't be mentioned. So you're right, it made the whole thing feel weird and shady.
Well, that's interesting that you say that you thought, are they in witness protection? Because imagine if you thought that and you thought, so these people whose own lives might also be at risk, I think I'm going to stay well away from this case. I don't really understand what's going on. It all seems very confusing and the stakes are obviously very high. One child is already missing and the police are very worried about the family by the look of things. That is the exact opposite of the kind of message that you would want to communicate, which is, we need your help.
Were the biological family allowed to identify themselves and give media interviews?
No, no one was. In fact, to this day, no one is allowed to advocate for William. No one.
So when William went missing, the person who got to decide about his image and what happened was not the police, not the biological family, not the foster family, but some bureaucrat in the department? Like who?
Precisely. So, well, it's law, it's legislation. So, yes, the Department of Family and Community Services decided.
So who were the persons of interest once it was realised that William wasn't in fact just a lost child?
One of the things that really intrigued the police was a phone call that the foster mum had made from the house that morning. When she'd arrived, she'd seen that her mum had all this washing piling up. And so she said, what's going on? And her mum said, the washing machine's broken. And she said, well, we should do something about that. So on the morning of William's disappearance, she rang the local washing machine repairman and said, and when are you going to come and fix the machine? Now that person automatically joins the circle of people the police will now want to rule out. So they call them persons of interest. It doesn't mean that they're suspects. That's going too far. Sometimes it's read that way by the public, or this must be someone they're suspicious of. Not necessarily. But let's say, for example, that you know that she's called someone who might then be coming to the house that morning. Well, the first thing you want to do as a police officer or a detective is say to yourself, well, did he come to the house that morning? And if so, did he happen to arrive just as William ran out onto the road? Was there an accident? Did he pick him up and take him? And so they looked at Bill Spedding because he was the person that she'd called. There was no evidence to link him to the case. There was no evidence that he was even in the street. But the naming of him and then the subsequent raids on his house where they brought in cadaver dogs and turned over the woodpile and did DNA on the mattresses from his office and took away his computers, I mean, his lawyer will argue that that makes him look like he's involved. And it's really hard to get yourself uninvolved once your name has been linked to a case. They do the same thing with other people who are like sexual predators, sex pests, pedophiles who live in the area. They will all be on the persons of interest list. In the case of William, there were 600 names on the list. So they'll go around to all the local sex pests and predators and they'll say, where were you on the day? And they'll get a statement from them all.
600?
600, yes. Well, in the case of Daniel Morecambe, there were 3,000. So, because he disappeared from a much busier area, obviously.
Just amongst us.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So that's just an indication of we don't even realise who's
Sure.
just in our communities.
Sure. And those who don't have reasonable alibis go up the list. You know, they're going to have to be looked at, poked and prodded a bit more. Now, Bill Spedding was an interesting addition to the list because he isn't a convicted pedophile. He doesn't have any child sex charges against his name. But because he was named, he suddenly felt that he was part of this pool of quite disgusting people. And he has taken serious defamation action against media organisations that described him as a pedophile because he's not.
Gary Jubelin, I've seen headlines about him being charged. He was taken off the investigation. That's another one of those kind of shady things around this case that I haven't really understood. You know Gary, you've spoken to him a lot. What's been his role? He was the lead of this investigation and now he's been charged with a crime himself?
That's right. So he was the head of Strike Force Rosanne, which is the name of the investigation into William, and then he was taken off it after about 3 years. He is accused of recording conversations without a warrant. And he still has to address those charges in court. So there's a limit really on what we can say. He has pleaded not guilty. We do know that. He is a fascinating individual because very, very often you don't hear very much about detectives, but he's a really well-known person. He's been in an episode of Underbelly and a book has been written about him and he's had some amazing success as a police officer. And there are a lot of people who are devastated that his career has come to an end over this alleged misconduct. He has pleaded not guilty in the William Tyrrell case, and it's because I feel that he recorded a conversation that he was worried that he might not be able to get any other way. It's not to say that anyone's guilty or not guilty.
So it was something he did during the course of investigating William's disappearance.
Yes.
That he did in a way that was perhaps not by the book or not legal. That's the allegation.
That's the allegation. So New South Wales Police, New South Wales is a convict state. The idea that we ever had our innocence is a nonsense. This state, the idea that, Sydney lost its innocence when such and such happened. We were a bunch of thieves and we were and bad guys ruled over by prison wardens. That's the history of this state. And the New South Wales Police, there have been a number of instances over the years where they've been accused of wrongdoing. You have former detectives in prison for murder. So,
Roger Rogerson.
Right. So there are very strict rules around the way you gather evidence because, you probably heard of, criminals being verbaled or criminals being bounced or criminals, being forced into confessions. So to stop any of that from happening or to try to prevent it from happening, they have very strict rules. And one of those rules is that you're not meant to record conversations with people without a warrant. They're supposed to know that they're being recorded. That's true in journalism too. You can't go around recording conversations with people without telling them. Now, Gary has said he had a really good reason to record this conversation, an operational reason, and that's how he will defend himself. But it will be for the court to decide.
There are a lot of theories about what could have happened to William. And I know that's what the inquest is trying to determine. You've been at the inquest. What's it like and who's there?
Well, it's being held at the new Coroner's Court. So the old Coroner's Court in Sydney used to be in the inner city. And it was a really terrible location, actually. I knew somebody who lived quite near it. The kind of city had built up around it. And I asked her once, why she'd moved. She said, I had to move. I had to get away from the Coroner's Court. And I thought, what a strange thing to say. Why do you have to get away from the Coroner's Court? And she said, there's a certain sound, Caroline, that a mother makes when she sees and has to identify the body of her child. And I couldn't hear it again. And I thought to myself, okay. So they opened a new Coroner's Court because this one had become quite crowded in and it's hard to park and so on. They opened a brand new complex out in Lidcombe. It's about 50 minutes driving time from the CBD. It's very new. It's a very smart-looking building, very shiny, lots of steel elevators, and there's like a kind of circular staircase in the middle. You have to go through a metal detector like at the airport to get in. Lots of parking, wide open spaces. In fact, the morgue is there as well, so all the steel drawers where the bodies are kept and the autopsies are done. It's now the main forensic evidence place for Sydney. Very expensive-looking building, very attractive-looking building. When it opened, actually they were concerned about the impact on the public because, people live out there too. And so they had an open day and 2,000 people turned up. People are so curious about morgues and autopsies and inquests. All these people came to just, they opened all the drawers where the bodies go and they showed them everything, this is how it'll be, to try to destigmatise it, if you will, to demystify it for people. So that's where the inquest is being held. The coroner sits at the front of the court under the coat of arms, as is normally the case.
Does it feel like a courtroom?
Yes, very much so. So she sits up the front in robes. Her name is Harriet Graham. And then you have a bar table, which is where all the lawyers sit. And then you have the public gallery. And on one side to the right, as you open the door, the Foster family sits. And to the left, William's biological family sits. It's been very busy. Some days it's impossible to get a seat. Other days where, there's no high-profile witnesses to be called, it can be very quiet and sort of half-empty.
Is the gallery full of journalists?
No, because there is also a media room where they pipe in both the audio and the video. And most journalists find that a more comfortable place to work because, firstly you have plugs and so on for your computers and your phones. You can continue to stay in touch with your office about what's happening by texting and so on, which you can't really do in the courtroom because the courtroom, the court represents the gravity of the offence. It's a place of solemnity and near silence so that witnesses can be heard, questions can be asked. It's not that, whereas journalists, when they get together and they're covering a case, they're cluttering away on keyboards and they're doing other tasks at the same time. They're taking a lot of notes, and it wouldn't be appropriate to mix those things.
What's the interaction like between the biological and foster families?
There isn't very much.
Do they acknowledge each other?
Yes, they have done. They have acknowledged each other, but there isn't a lot of interaction between them, no.
So, I like to imagine the mothers united in grief.
William's biological mother was only there on the first day, and she was distraught, absolutely distraught. She lasted about 10 minutes, and then friends and family members put her in a taxi, and one of them went home with her. So she's finding it very, very difficult.
But her mother's there, and you've developed a relationship with her mother.
No, his mother is there.
Oh, it's his mother.
Yes, the grandmother that is there is William's grandmother on the father's side. She's been there every day, and William's father has been there every day too. And William's foster mother has been there every day. I haven't seen his foster father this time. He was there in March. There was a week's worth of hearings in March and he was there, but I haven't seen him for the past month.
The inquest was was moved to Taree. Why is that?
Well, Taree is very close to Kendall, and there's a lot of witnesses up there that they wanted to interview, and rather than move them all to Sydney, they decided to do them up there. But it was a catastrophe. The audio-visual equipment didn't work as planned. The courtroom had only recently been opened. It wasn't working properly. A number of the witnesses that they hoped to call turned out not to be available. But the whole inquest has been like that, actually. There's been a lot of closed court, a lot of delays, a lot of suppression, very frustrating. The coroner has twice apologised to the family for staying engaged, for having the courage to keep turning up when it's actually very frustrating.
There was a moment that you described in the podcast where they talked about moving it to Taree, and the biological father said he couldn't afford to travel.
Well, there's no way he could afford it. I mean, to go up to Taree and then you have to get a hotel room for maybe 5 or 6 nights, that's going to be $600 or $700. I mean, it's a lot of money. And his lawyer stood and said that they had applied for funds from the Department of Community Services and they had been rejected. And the coroner said, well, that's not acceptable. I mean, he's been here every day. He definitely was not always there for William when William was alive. He acknowledges that himself, that he could have done a better job. He wishes he had done a better job. He wishes William had never been in care. But he's been there every day since since the inquest has been underway. And William's foster mother said from the back of the court, I'll pay. And of course that would never be allowed. And so the department was pressed to come up with the funds. I mean, the department has $1 billion budget, $1 billion. And this was likely to cost a few hundred. And they did indeed come up with the funds.
What do you think happened to William?
Well, I know this for sure. We will find out. 100% we will find out.
Why do you think that?
Because I feel that truth is really resilient. When everything else falls away, all of the song and the dance and the robes and the lawyers it's still there. What happened to him is still there. And at some point we will know. It's inconceivable to me that we don't find out. And history tells me that we will find out. I remember covering the Daniel Morecambe case for almost a decade, and there were many, many times when people said, we'll never know. But we do know. We have an answer. And I believe with William we will find an answer. And there was a little boy in Victoria, people may remember, whose name was Jaden Lesky, who went missing. And he found his way to the surface in the most extraordinary way. He'd been put into a plastic bag and dumped into a lake, and he found his way out of that bag and to the surface of the lake. His body turned up, and that's truth. There he is. He's lying now on the banks of the river, and what are you going to do about it? You're going to act on that. And I think that will happen with William. He will make himself known. He will appear. And then when he does, we will have a better idea.
Does anyone that you've spoken to believe that he could still be alive?
Yes. And that, to me, was the most difficult part of the decision-making process, in deciding whether or not to do the podcast, because I thought, there were a lot of issues I had to address within myself, but I thought to myself that yes, there are some people who say that William is still alive and that we don't know the circumstances in which he is being held, and it's not something that you would want to think about for too long. A great deal of pressure, a great deal of public attention could force something to go wrong there. People could panic. People could make a decision to bring things to an end. And I think that if you think that he could still be alive, then you would want to avoid at all costs creating a situation where his life may then be at risk. Maybe in 2015, or he went missing in 2014, so let's say in 2015 I would have thought, there was a chance that he might still be returned to a school or a church. It didn't have to end badly even after a year. You could still let him go. You've got what you wanted. You could, but it's now 5 years. He's 8. So in the end I thought, do I think he's alive? No. But I accept that some people do.
When you're covering a story like this, and it's true crime, you've always been very, very good at retaining the humanity of that person and remembering that this isn't a mystery. It's not a little boy in a Spiderman suit. It's a little boy.
Mm-hmm.
How do you balance those two things with doing your job and also thinking about that?
Mm.
I know it's something that you take very seriously.
Because everyone feels the same. When you're at the inquest, sometimes we talk to each other, not just reporters working on the case, but everybody working on the case. And, we see him sometimes. You dream about him. You wake up in the middle of the night and you're bolt upright because you think, what if this? What if that? Because it's real. It's not like a case where we have a body and we're trying to figure out what happened. It's a real little boy who is missing. And that is incredibly difficult when you're covering it, because it's not a game. It's not sport to guess what might have happened. It's not something you want to get involved in conversations like, no one has done this, to be fair. No one has come up to me and said, wow, do you think it could be like this or that? No one has done that. Everyone has treated it with the reverence and respect that it deserves. But I feared that. I feared becoming involved in something that was entertainment, and actually it isn't. And I also was very worried about compounding the suffering of people who have suffered an unimaginable loss. And it would seem, I don't know why people get dealt the hands that they are dealt, but you don't want to make the circumstances worse. And I was concerned about that too. But then the one story that we're always told is that the police don't want you to stop talking about William, and they don't want you to stop thinking about William, and they don't want people to forget William, and they don't want this case to go to the cold case files, and they don't want there to be no answer, and we don't want William's sister Lindsay to pick this up in 10 years' time and have to be trying to figure out what happened. And I don't want this to be a Beaumont children. We want an answer, and you don't get an answer by being silent about it.
To hear more of Caroline's investigations, head to your podcast app and subscribe to Nowhere Child. It's a beautiful treatment of an incredibly tough and upsetting story that is told with such sensitivity and respect to all the parties involved. And it's really worth a listen to understand so much about the foster system and how the law works and about how the investigation unfolded. And for me, it answered so many questions that I had about William Tyrrell and his disappearance. And if you're after more stories about true crime, why not subscribe to our podcast, True Crime Conversations, where Jessie Stevens interviews experts on the world's most fascinating and frightening crimes, from the story of Samantha Knight's disappearance to Ivan Milat. No Filter is produced by Eliza Ratliff, and I'll see you on Mamma Mia.